Dr. Farrell, this is clearly not a tobacco-free show.
No.
We, long past when network TV had Lucky Strikes, as corporate sponsors, etc. The Giza Death Star continues to unofficially be sponsored by several major tobacco conglomerates. Literally,
No,
who else would smoke the volume of tobacco that gets consumed on this program?
well, that's right. This is true.
If I was allowed to smoke in my office anymore, you'd see me going at it too. One cigar is worth a whole pack of cigarettes, Dr. Farrell.
Hey, listen, I got a good cigar for you if you like cigars, and I know you do.
I do.
Try a Gurkha Grand Reserve.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, as soon as
listen,
you're going to say that, I'm like, I like Gurkhas. Do you like that?
yeah, well, listen, I had a friend of mine, a member of this website, send me some cigars prior to the San Mateo conference, and he sent a Cohiba, which was really good, and then this Gurkha, which I had never had, and oh my word, I thought whoever came up with this cigar, they need a Nobel Prize or something. So yeah, I've been smoking Gurkhas whenever I get the money.
Gurkhas are awesome. Yeah, I'm a big fan. I do some Perdomos and.
Oh no, not the Hillary.
Well, it just says Dr. Farrell loves Gurkhas, not Hillary. So.
Well, I know, but still, it's the picture.
Put that in your pipe. Well, Dr. Farrell, tobacco aside, the reason I bring that up is because a lot of things have changed over the years. Some things have been forgotten. I work with a lot of different generations of people in my line of work. I lead teams of people to produce a marketing effect. And I work with a lot of millennials, a lot of 20-somethings. And I bring up things like, just mark that as station identification. And they're like, what's station identification? I'm like, okay, Google it. And they still don't know. They don't know what I'm talking about. And or I'll say Meathead and Edith, and they still don't. Somebody today in my generation popped off with, Daniel, you're the grand poobah of whatever this is. And but again, we then had to explain that, yes, we understand the rest of you don't know what a grand poobah is. And it goes like this. Things get forgotten. They get swept under the rug. We lose track of the knowledge. We forget what the debate was. It's interesting how certain debates just fall off the table, and, little events that happened back in the Bill and Hillary Clinton era, and we're not even talking about it anymore, which is
right.
So I want to label today's show the Dredge Report, because we're going to dredge up. We're going to dredge up some questions that might be considered obvious, water under the bridge, old news, but that if we peel back the lid, we're still intrinsically polarized about and partially maybe blind over. And, an example of that, it's not the topic of today's show, but we're going to do a rather special format show today. So guys, get ready for this. But, it'd be like trying to claim that the war between the states, North and South, has no relevance anymore. It's not even significant. Race aside, it is still it has a major cultural impact on, how people view each other. So even in the 1970s, when somebody says on the Dick Cavett show, you and your New York audience, some of that is coming out that, wow, there's still a little bit of hostility there between, above and below the Mason-Dixon line, right?
Yes.
And probably both ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in this particular episode of our show than I do. And it is simply with the goal of setting up the show and then ultimately turning it loose to you again. But also I've got some major quotations that I'm going to try to get your response to that I've sort of curated and handpicked. So I'd like to kick off the show today by giving some people, giving our audience some background. So why are we having this particular show? Well, there is on C-SPAN an episode of the Dick Cavett Show. And for those of you that don't remember the Dick Cavett Show, you're probably under 30 years old or younger, and you should definitely go back and watch a bunch of episodes, because it will make that show you're watching with Whoopi or Phil Donahue look like a totally different animal. And I mean, there's some lightweight versions of it, but all in all, it's a pretty substantive show. And this one hails from 1971. during the height of the Vietnam War. Nixon is in office, and John Kerry, who many of you will recognize as a former contender for president, is debating John O'Neill, who's head of another organization. And what Dr. Farrell and I did in preparation for this show is, well, we watched this video, and it is about 80 minutes or something like that. It is, you know, you take out commercials, it comes down to about 70 or something like that. But it is a fairly lengthy video, but it is worth your time. So what we're going to do is, by the time you're watching this episode, we will have the link to this video in the show notes, and you'll be able to click on it. And I would encourage you, before you watch the rest of this episode, just go ahead and stop, press stop now, and go and watch this episode of the Dick Cavett Show, because everything we're going to be talking today probably has some reference to that show. Okay. So that said, for those of you who are ignoring us right now and just going to keep on with the show, that's okay too. The topic is essentially the Vietnam War and what's happened with media. And so I want to give a little bit of background about the Vietnam War, on which Dr. Farrell and I will predicate our discussion. We're both interested in history. I was one of Dr. Farrell's history students. I'm going to rattle this off as quickly as humanly possible over about a 2-minute period. And we're going to set up this discussion about the Vietnam War. But I think it's really important that we situate the war in its historical context, because we're a show about Nazis. We promise that. Every episode will bring Nazis into the show. And so we're going to just kick off the show with Nazis as a way into the Vietnam War. So here we go. So the scene is World War II. And French Indochina it's essentially colonized by the French from the colonial period. It's being occupied by the Japanese under collaboration, who are collaborating with the Vichy French and the Nazis. So what's happening there is that the organization called the Viet Minh is founded by Ho Chi Minh to fight that Japanese occupation. So essentially to fight some Nazis and some Japanese friends of Nazis and some Vichy Soi French friends of Nazis. So that's where we get the so-called Viet Cong. As France and French Indochina is liberated by the Allies, what happens is the Japanese then begin to intern the French in French Indochina. They intern them in Vietnam because rightly they can no longer trust them. The French are having secret meetings and talking and chafing against the Japanese occupation. They're going to do something about it. So the Japanese lock them up and they create the puppet empire of Vietnam. And this really sets things up as an opportunity for Ho Chi Minh, because following that, there's a deep famine of 1944 to 1945. It allows the Viet Minh to rebel and radically boost their popularity. The natives don't want the Japanese there. They want some food. They're chafing under the domination, just like they've chafed under the domination of the French. And what's important to know here is the Viet Minh are doing this apparently with American support. So the U.S. is supporting the Viet Cong at this point. Ho Chi Minh sets up the Independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam and begins his reign with a speech in Hanoi in front of 500,000 people by paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence. So there's a relationship between the United States and the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese at this time. But then immediately following that, Ho Chi Minh begins his reign of terror and murder. And, unfortunately, it gets bad. There are a lot of atrocities. The Allies agree that the French own Vietnam, but understand the French don't have the wherewithal to take it back. So the Brits, therefore, occupy South Vietnam, and nationalist Chinese land in North Vietnam and begin disarming the Japanese. And the idea is they'll work toward each other. So what Ho Chi Minh does is negotiate a treaty with the French, who can't regain control. They don't have the military strength to maintain their colony, and says, look, the French will get the South and Viet Minh will get the North. But what happens is the French betray him and they land in Hanoi and they oust Ho Chi Minh from the city. So he begins a guerrilla war against them, which spreads to Laos and Cambodia. So hence we have the beginnings of what will become the Vietnam War. Then, when the Chinese communists win their civil war in China in 1949, they start arming the North Vietnamese, and the Soviets and China recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the US and Brits recognize the French state of Vietnam in Saigon. The problem is, again, the French can't hold it. The Chinese begin training the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, into an army, and the French and the Americans at this point consider using nuclear weapons against the Viet Minh. In fact, there's a plan to drop up to 3 nuclear weapons in North Vietnam in tactical places to stop the war. Well, it's not a war, but to stop the communists. So Nixon at this time is arguing for a land war, and Eisenhower is opposed to a land war in Asia, so that's now become a phrase. You don't want to be caught in a land war in Asia. And at this time, the Viet Minh defeat the French finally at Dien Bien Phu, and at the Geneva Conference of 1954, the French cede independence to Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, effectively dividing Vietnam. What follows, and we're almost wrapping this up, but I just want to make sure we have the picture of the land. The U.S. begins PSYOPs, psychological operations, during a transition period. There's a transition period where people are allowed to move freely for so many months between Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. You're allowed to settle where you want. And so the U.S. begins a wholesale campaign to terrify Roman Catholics into moving south, saying you're going to be massacred by the communists. They hate Roman Catholics. If you're a traditional Christian, you need to move south. And Ho Chi Minh then follows this up with what they call a rent reduction campaign, which means killing 1 in 1,000 Vietnamese by quota. So in other words, we're going to reduce the number of people so that there's more money to go around, et cetera. And a land reform campaign, which means going into the rural areas and killing 1 in 160 villagers, again by quota, to basically clear land for other people, et cetera. So this is something that anybody that studied Stalin, that practical statesman, is aware that he was practical about. You kill enough people, rent gets cheaper. So, by the way, after our housing crisis in the United States, I think we should all keep that between ourselves, because who knows what. So to finish this little bit of history out and get us right up to the war, the U.S. actually did not sign the 1954 Geneva Convention, nor did the puppet they place in power in South Vietnam, Diem. So Diem becomes the prime minister of the South and immediately begins military operations to oust his political rivals, which includes disappearances and all the sort of genocidal tactics against a couple of religious groups in Vietnam, and usually is blaming the North Vietnamese for the atrocities. So we see this a lot in totalitarian regimes, South America, Syria, etc. That stuff begins in earnest there. And then he rigs the vote. They have ostensibly democratic elections in the South, but he rigs the vote, which is supervised by his brother, and wins the vote with like a 98.9% victory, landslide victory. But every other independent polls at the time says there's no way Diem would have won. Well, Diem is a Roman Catholic. And this is significant. Remember, the Roman Catholics are all moving to the South, but most Vietnamese are Buddhist. And they're a little bit alarmed when Diem dedicates the country of South Vietnam to the Virgin Mary, and then begins brutal anti-communist campaigns. So rounding up people, mass killings, etc. He visits the United States. Some of you will, in listening to the show, will remember this, and there's a parade in his honor in New York City. And John Foster Dulles says, hey, look, we chose Diem because there simply was no better alternative on the ground at the time. And that brings us to 1960, when John F. Kennedy succeeds Nixon in the White House, who succeeded Eisenhower, who succeeded Truman, and John F. Kennedy is squared off against Khrushchev. And of course, we get the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the rise of the Berlin Wall, and we negotiate. There's a negotiation to divide Laos between communist and democratic forces. At this point, John F. Kennedy is killed. For those of you that don't know, he's not still alive that we know of, in a bunker somewhere. He's actually gone, but we'll hold out hope. And unlike Elvis, who clearly is still walking around, and we plan to have him on the show one of these days. But I think he's living near the Arctic Circle. But After Kennedy is killed, Lyndon Baines Johnson visits Saigon and declares Diem the Churchill of Vietnam. So sort of the opposite of what John Foster Dulles says. Kennedy has, at this point, I'm sorry, this is not after Kennedy's killed. LBJ visits while Kennedy's still alive. Kennedy resists his advisors, but eventually consents to the beginnings of counterinsurgency in Cambodia, Laos, and probably Vietnam. Special forces, black ops, all kinds of things going on in Southeast Asia, assassinations and various things, including something in the South called the Strategic Hamlet Program, which is a way of relocating villagers out of their huts, giving them new fortified huts and isolating them from the communists, which is a whole interesting story if you want to go down that path. But then of course, the CIA gets tired of Diem because Diem doesn't want to work with anybody. He won't collaborate with anybody. He won't be reasonable. So the CIA sponsors a military coup. The generals of the country take over and kill Diem. And then Kennedy is assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson engages in the escalation of the war in Vietnam on the pretext of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Mm-hmm. And then that brings us up to his successor, Richard Nixon, who inherits this and the show. So if you haven't stopped and watched the show, again, I would encourage you to go and watch that episode, the Dick Cavett Show, and then come back and watch the rest of this. So now, Dr. Farrell, mm-hmm. We've set up the historical context. The first question I want to ask you is, have I left anything out? Is there anything you want to say about, the basis for how we got from World War II to Vietnam?
Well, there are some things I'd point out that are very reminiscent of where we are today, and that is that Johnson had many friends that were contractors, large contractors, that stood to gain from American involvement in Vietnam. One was a very large construction company that was actually tapped to build the American bases around Hue. That was the scene of some very severe, sharp fighting during the Tet Offensive in 1967-68 that led to Johnson's withdrawal. So in other words, we have kind of the Johnson version of Dick Cheney and Halliburton lurking in the background in Vietnam. The other thing that many people have pointed out that I think should be added to this discussion, and again, folks, I have no idea where Daniel's taking this, okay? So I'm just putting this out there. But the other thing is that, yes, I'm sure. But the other thing is that you had the CIA's Air America, the front group, that was involved with drug running in Vietnam. They were shifting the heroin trade at this time, a massive reconstruction of the world heroin trade. The CIA was clearly involved in the drug business, and Vietnam was crucial to the control of it at that period of history. So that's another little tidbit to throw in there. But other than that, I think, yeah, you did a fairly good review of the whole mess.
Well, good. It was a painful study, I have to say. There are some images and film and accounts from Vietnam that still haunt me to this day, and part of my commitment in my personal charity work is my own sense of restitution to the best of my ability for that. It is a very difficult subject. And so I will now tell the audience that some of the topics that we're going to cover in the show today are disturbing. So if you have really young kids and you think they might be disturbed by hearing a very factual account of what went on in the war, you might want to, take them into the other room, etc. You will definitely hear references to that in the Dick Cavett episode as well. It probably won't be in as much detail, possibly by design, and also because there's certain things you just can't say over the air, broadcast TV in that era. Okay, so Dr. Farrell, I'm going to start off with some basic questions, and this falls under, in this episode of our Dredge Report, this falls under that stuff about, well, this stuff obvious, isn't the debate over on this, but I still want to get your take, and it's still part of the setup of the show, before we dig into the meat, to kind of get your take on the key issues that people were discussing in the 70s. Let's mention Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, then I'll ask you a question about it.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, Vietnamization was Nixon's way of describing nation building or democratization. In other words, this was the first American attempt to go in and massively escalate a military presence in a region, and then try to get a puppet government installed that would go along with an American agenda, essentially an imperialistic agenda, by reforming their institutions of government. So in other words, Vietnam, the way I look at it, Daniel, looking back over the whole history of American involvement around the world, all the way back to Wilson and the intervention in Haiti, is you have this idea that America can intervene and then change the culture and institutions in a way that's amenable to the American power elite. And the most recent example of this, of course, is Iraq. We went in there with military force and then brought along a bunch of companies that were supposedly going to rebuild Iraq's infrastructure and make it this glorious paradise of democracy. Well, we've seen what's happened since then. Since the fall of Saddam Hussein, Iraq has basically broken into its constituent parts. The same thing, more or less, I think, happened in Vietnam. You had the attempt under the government of General Nguyen II that succeeded Diem, that was the president of South Vietnam all the way up to the fall of Saigon in 1975. You had the same attempt being made by America there. We'd go in and then gradually pull out and turn the war over to the South Vietnamese and prop them up. And, you know, this didn't work any better then than it has worked in Iraq, and it didn't work any better in Vietnam than it did in Haiti. We're still playing the piper and paying the piper for all of these interventions, and they've done us absolutely no good. What they've done is they've created a bunch of enemies. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so Vietnamization, described at the time as we're going to pass the torch to the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. We're going to train their military, help supervise free elections, get them a government, which of course will be sympathetic to democratic interests, and it's part of our Cold War, our overall Cold War policy. I have a couple of questions about it. One is the charge leveled at the time. Rewind back to the 1970s, and for those of you that are 20-something, this is the stuff you don't read in Wikipedia. You don't get the sense of living through it. At the time, the charge was made, and it was made on the Dick Cavett show, that Vietnamization is not a way of transitioning a nation to out of a war, either nation, but it's a way of extending the war.
Yes.
And potentially prolonging the war by defining the mission as an open-ended one, and one that can't possibly be accomplished.
Right.
So my question to you is this. So we see, on the one hand, we see in, my first question is this. On the one hand, we see in the Korean War, almost the first attempt at nation building, the first attempt to set up a puppet government sympathetic to Western interests. And now, to this day, South Korea is the single largest military occupation of the U.S. on the planet. It is clearly our colony, or in political science terminology, a client state. And so that we had that information already. And then, of course, you know, on the other end of the bookends, we have the Bay of Pigs, where you know, you support a people and then abandon them at the critical moment, and who pays the price? But the people that you said you were trying to help. And of course, this is what happens in South Vietnam is we do this so-called Vietnamization, and then of course the moment we pull out, the North Vietnamese invade, and there are significant reprisals and so on, and there's no more South Vietnam. So my question to you is, did the U.S. know that Vietnamization would fail at the time? Did they know full well that it could not and would not succeed, and it was even more of a blatant way of extending the war than would be discussed on something like the Dick Cavett show, because they're just not that cynical?
Wow, that's a difficult question, Daniel. At the time, trying to remember back to the discussions back then, I do think that there was very clearly, at least in the American political arena, as exemplified by John Kerry on the Dick Cavett show, I do think that he was voicing the thoughts of a great deal of American public opinion at that time, both in the Democratic and in the Republican Party. In other words, he's speaking for an interest or a viewpoint on the Vietnam War that was true across the political spectrum. That this is insanity. It's not going to go anywhere. It's never going to work. We need to get out, and we need to cut American losses and the loss of lives in Vietnam. I do think that there was a segment within the Pentagon and the intelligence community that viewed Vietnamization as a policy that would work. And that party constantly, to this day, as far as I'm aware, points to the fact that what really, in their opinion, caused the fall of South Vietnam was when Congress shut off the funding for the Vietnamization program. I think it was 74 or 75, shortly before the fall of Saigon, American aid to South Vietnam just stopped. And that party has consistently blamed the fall of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, because of that vote in Congress. But I don't know. Quite frankly, I think that Vietnamization, as you say, was simply an open-ended mission statement for a war that they intended to keep going ad infinitum, without end, as long as there was a government in Saigon that would go along with the program. I personally don't think that it would ever have been successful, given, as you've outlined, the history of what happened in Vietnam during World War II and after. I don't think it would have ever been successful, simply because you had that festering Vietnamese resentment of colonization by anyone, be it the French, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Russians, you name it, they're against it. They want to be free of it once and for all. So I don't think personally that the program would ever have worked.
Well, I find this an interesting topic because I mean, that's really my question. We can see, hindsight is 2020. We can see now that it would never have worked, but I wonder if they saw then and if it was by design. So that brings me to my next question. Another way of asking the same thing, but with a little bit more of that creepy oomph that you like, Dr. Farrell, which is, was the policy of setting up puppet governments ultimately successful on a global scale since Vietnam? We have Sarkozy in France, trained by the CIA, much more American than he is French. We have governments all over the world that are still polarized in either, the Ukraine. We tried to set up a puppet government in the Ukraine. Was the policy of puppet governments ultimately a secret policy of the United States that exists still today,
Yes.
reasonably successful? And here it comes, was Vietnam an initial experiment designed to collapse once the data from the experiment was gathered?
Oh boy.
Erasing the evidence.
Yeah. Okay. I do think.
Love me now?
Yeah. that's a zinger. Let me tell you, that's a zinger. All right. Here's my take on it, Daniel. I do think that yes, that the United States after World War II, under the Dulles brothers, under the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd, quite literally, which to me represents the American plutocracy, the American branch of what I've been calling the Nazi International, because these guys had essentially a fascist outlook on the relationship between government, the military, and the corporate world, and therefore, the Nazis were good bedfellows for them. But I do think that this group centered around the Dulles brothers, but they're just the public representatives of a vast power structure in American politics that goes way back, predates President Wilson. This group had, as you know, attempted to launch a coup against Franklin Roosevelt shortly after he took office. That coup failed, fortunately. But this group after World War II, I do think, takes the decision to install as many puppet governments as it can and to identify and recruit young and upcoming politicians in key areas like Western Europe. You've pointed out Sarkozy, but you also have to point out the opposition to President de Gaulle. And de Gaulle, of course, knew exactly what the game was and would have nothing to do with it. De Gaulle took the decision very early on, as you remember, to take France out of NATO, to kick NATO out of France. And then after this was done, de Gaulle pursues his own independent French nuclear deterrent, the force de frappe, in order to secure French sovereignty, basically, as he sees it, between the East and the West. But this is a policy that I do think goes on. There is an interesting book or a movie out with Ewan McGregor, the British actor, called Ghostwriter, and what the plot of the movie is about precisely CIA recruitment of leaders of major Western countries, including the British Prime Minister. And the kind of implication there is that, you know, Tony Blair is the person they're talking about, all right? So I do think that's an official policy. Number two, part of that policy, particularly with respect to Vietnam and other hotspots in the world, Egypt in 1954 with the overthrow of Farouk, 1951-52 with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. These were, as we know, CIA operations, but the boots on the ground, as I've been pointing out to people over and over again, that absolutely conducted these coups were this post-war Nazi outfit. These were the people involved in overthrowing those regimes. So why does that play into Vietnam? Well, it's very significant, as you pointed out, that during World War II, you had this constellation of Vichy French, Nazis, and Imperial Japanese trying to clamp down on Vietnam. Well, the Nazi presence remains in that area of the world, and it's Waffen-SS people that are originally helping train the French at Dien Bien Phu, and later on these people are involved in training the American Green Berets. And I personally have thought for a long time, Daniel, that the American atrocities that were committed in Vietnam, Lieutenant Calley and so on with the massacre at My Lai, that these people had some connection, and again, this is intuition, I'm not basing this off of any evidence other than that presence in Indochina of those wartime fascist forces that stayed there after the war was over, that these forces were involved in the training of so-called American elite forces, and I strongly suspect that these people are involved in the CIA's Operation Phoenix program, which was quite literally nothing more than an assassination program that was conducted in Vietnam. So your question is this an experiment that was run to see how it would work vis-a-vis the rest of the world? And my answer, Daniel, has to be, given what we have seen since Vietnam, particularly given what we have seen in areas of the world like Latin America, like the Middle East, that the answer to that is yes. It was a test bed in that sense for these types of programs to learn how they could go in with military intervention, install puppet governments, and here's the real intention of the operation: suck as much wealth out of that region as they could under the guise of American corporate contracts, defense contracts, infrastructure contracts, and so on, and then simply leave once the wealth was drained. And the other thing I strongly suspect is a part of this experiment is, as I suggested earlier, you had that enormous drug trade that was based on the Golden Triangle right there in Malaysia, Burma, Vietnam, and so on. The world drug trade, if you read the books of Henry Kruger, the world drug trade is at this time being completely restructured. And that too plays into this CIA drug running, you know, mafia, fascist international, whatever it is you want to call it, that is driving and deriving a lot of money from this international drug trade for whatever reason. So do I think it's an experiment? Do I think you're on to something there? Yes, absolutely I do.
Oh, Dr. Farrell, I'm not saying that it's that. I'm just asking you what you think. I'm merely
Yeah,
the
I
host.
know. Yeah, I know you're just the host. Yeah, but you don't come up with questions. I know you well enough. You don't come up with questions like that unless you're thinking it, okay? So,
No, everybody has a
yeah, yeah, yeah.
once in a while. They're worth about what, the New York Times is when you're done.
Yeah, set it to music, Daniel. I know you. I know you too well.
All right. So I will admit that I'm curious anyway. And what got me curious about this, I'll confess, Dr. Farrell, was a seemingly completely unrelated event. But you just pick up on vibes, and doesn't mean anything. You can't trust it, but it does make you curious, and it makes you go, hmm. Oh wait, I got to do Dr. Farrell. It makes you go, hmm. Mini me. But 9/11 got me thinking about it because of Building 7 and some claims that people made that, I mean, obviously rampant speculation, but that Building 7 was actually the control center for the entire operation of 9/11 and was brought down to cover the tracks and leave no trace
Yes.
of that control center at the end. I found that really curious as a hypothesis. And so when I think of this, and that sort of brings me to the final question on this particular section of our chapter today, which is, if this is that kind of experiments, did we therefore abandon intentionally the South Vietnamese to their doom? Did we abandon the Cubans to their doom at the Bay of Pigs? And do we continue to set people up, as we have in Laos and other places, to think they're going to be fighting and supported by the United States, only to abandon them, not because of political pressures and lack of commitment on our part, but by design, to abandon them to their doom? And what potential reason would we have to put out a public story of, yes, we're helping these people to stand for themselves, with the actual intention of making sure that we wipe out any democratic elements or any elements that ostensibly share our feelings about democracy, et cetera, in these countries? Is this, in fact, in other words, an orchestrated attempt to destroy the possible emergence of democracy in countries that aren't the United States? And I ask that because one way that you would eradicate the evidence or the Building 7 of those people in that situation is you would amp them up, you would convince them with promises, and you would abandon them to their enemies, knowing that all trace of them would be wiped from the planet. And this is a really far-fetched speculation, but if one were just a little bit more cynical and said it's by design, now you have the U.S. intentionally destroying the birth of democracy everywhere it can find it, while publicly saying we have to defend democracy against communism and so on.
That is, again, a really, really interesting speculation. And I have to say, again, that my gut reaction would be yes, and for several reasons. If you look at Vietnam and contrast it to another famous incident that has cost the United States a potential ally, that's the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. Mossadegh, as you recall, was part of that Iranian party that had really been present in Iran since prior to World War I. It looked at the world and culture of Islam and knew that there was something wrong and that they would have to reform it. And Mossadegh, to a certain extent, came out of that party in Iran and nationalized Iran's oil industry and wanted to use that industry for the good of Iran. And part of that reform program was he was also going to try to address Islamic culture, Islamic religion itself. All right. Had that program been successful, if you look at the behavior of the United States, Great Britain, and France in particular after World War I, what what we all know happens is that the most extreme regimes are put into place in artificial countries. You know, you look at Iraq, and what you really have there is an artificial country that's created by people at Versailles drawing lines on a piece of paper, on a map. And of course, you have the British and American relationship with, you know, just I consider one of the most brutal, backward countries in the world, with Saudi Arabia. When you look at Mossadegh, what that may have done had he been successful is it would have modernized the Middle East, modernized the Islamic world, and been a potential contender, therefore, against the Western powers. So we got to go in and overthrow him and put in a brutal repressive regime, namely bring back the Shah, bring back the Pahlavi family, and put them on the peacock throne once again. All of this, I think, when you compare it to Vietnam, indicates that what the mechanism here is that the Western elite, particularly the United States, is attempting to harvest the wealth of a country. And in Vietnam's case, it's very interesting what has happened. If you go in and you look at what the United States did in the Vietnam War in Indochina, is it absolutely blasted apart the infrastructure of those countries. And then it suddenly pulls out, leaving these countries with blasted infrastructure, with tyrannical governments, and so on, yada, yada, yada. And then you'll notice that the United States' relationship now with Vietnam is kind of, oh, let's let bygones be bygones. Let's trade with each other. I'm in my kitchen. I have an office in my kitchen. And the big table and the chairs are all from Vietnam. They're made in Vietnam, and they're actually quite nice. But in other words, what we did was we established a condition where the infrastructure was so blown apart that the Chinese and the Russians were not in a position to be able to build it back up economically. They had their own economic problems. So the United States basically won the war in a certain sense economically, by going back in and saying, hey, you know, open up your markets to us, trade with us, you know, and everything will be forgiven. I think this is part of what the experiment was. Can we go in, ruin a country, and then make it economically dependent on us? And again, that formula, if you look at the Vietnam formula and apply it to the modern Middle East, this is exactly what we've done in Iraq. Exactly what we've done in Iraq. I suspect we're getting ready to do it in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. It won't work in Iran because, you know, we made our bed and now we have to lie in it. Iran sought out allies after the overthrow of the Shah in China and India and Russia. So Iran is not going to be there for us to pluck. But I think Turkey and Saudi Arabia are definitely on the menu as far as that goes. We tried it in Syria. That didn't work. Mr. Putin stepped in. But the Vietnam formula is definitely there. Bomb the daylights out of it. Suck the wealth out of it. Then leave. And then when no one else can pick up the tab for rebuilding, step back in.
I have three potential reasons for that I want to ask you about as the final question for the show. So I'm going to put it off until then, because if I ask it now, it'll derail us from this particular track that I disavow following, but I am nonetheless seeing emerge. All right, so you know, I want to ask you then a more macro level question, which is, let me put a couple of them together. Was the policy of containment, and you may need to explain what that is to people that, again, are younger than 40 or whatever, but was the policy of containment a failed policy? And was, by comparison, was the domino theory that JFK articulated a reasonable and accurate theory?
Oh, boy. The policy of containment is the policy, basically, that was authored by George F. Kennan for President Truman. It became a National Security Council memorandum. I believe it was number 48. You might have to correct me on that. I don't remember the exact number. But this was the memorandum that basically fashioned America's Cold War policy, beginning with the Truman administration and carrying right through Richard Nixon and even to a certain extent Gerald Ford. It's Ronald Reagan that completely throws it out and says, you know, it's time just to take out the Soviet Union and international communism altogether. Containment meant that the United States, through its allies and in conjunction with them, would seek to contain communist aggression wherever it occurred, be it in Korea, be it in Vietnam, wherever in the world it occurred. It later is the basis for Reagan's intervention in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas and the Contras and so on. This policy basically guided American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. It meant that it meant quite effectively that we would fight limited action wars, not with the purpose of a military victory, but simply for the purpose of stalemating any communist advance. All right. So there's one reason we get involved with all of these wars that we never win. We simply spend blood and treasure to contain a threat. Now, very interestingly, this policy is not American. The policy of containment was first articulated by guess who? By General Reinhard Gehlen and his Frontiere Ost in the days immediately after World War II, and it was sold to the Americans as the best way, as the best long-term way to address communism and contain it. In other words, contain communism until it implodes economically. All right. That was basically Gehlen's strategy. So the strategy, my friends, like it or not, it's a Nazi strategy. Okay.
We always like to remind you that Nazis will continue to appear on this show.
Yes, and they will appear in some very odd, weird places from time to time.
The Vietnam War, they didn't have any relevance there, and you were wrong.
And you're wrong. No, they appear in a major way in 9/11. Just wait for the new book to come out, folks. But anyway, and I have to be honest, when I found the information that's in the new book, even I had difficulty believing it. So that tells you what it's like. But anyway, this policy of containment was basically the U.S. official policy up until Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey in the CIA. Now, I forget what the second part of your question was. There was a second part of it.
Yeah, the second part was a policy or a theory, not a policy, but a theory within this policy articulated by John F. Kennedy, the domino theory.
The domino theory.
If what your comments are, and I'm doing this on purpose. So in order to bring this into the present day, we're going back to the earlier day, taking issues that we think are closed and forgotten, and we're reminding people that we were talking about them in the 70s,
right?
Like the Dick Cavett show, and then we're trying to bring people up to speed about what that discussion would have been like, so we can relate it to current issues.
Right.
So, and also we want to elevate the discussion of political science on this show. So yeah, the domino theory, Dr. Farrell.
Well, the domino theory was articulated, I believe, firstly during the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy picked up on it, and then, of course, Lyndon Johnson made it more or less his own bailiwick. But the domino theory pre-existed Kennedy, and in fact, if I remember correctly, it may have even been mentioned during the Korean War, General MacArthur, and so on and so forth. But this is the idea that if we lose certain strategic countries, then the countries surrounding them are going to fall. And again, if you press the idea behind the domino theory, it's really going back to World War I and the British geopolitician Sir Halford Mackinder that I've written about in some of my books. Halford Mackinder formulated that essential doctrine to Anglo-American or Western geopolitics, that world domination depends on the control of three regions. At the center of the world, Mackinder thinks you have the world island. In other words, that area in the Middle East from Cairo up to Jerusalem, up to up to Beirut, down to Amman, Jordan. In other words, that is the exact center of the world. Control that and have significant military presence in that region, and you will be able to project military power globally. But in order to control that region, then it's necessary to control another region, and this is what he calls the heartland. And the heartland, in Mackinder's theory, is basically Eastern Europe, Poland to Byelorussia, the Ukraine, over into the stands in Central Asia. That's the heartland, all right? And to control the heartland, says Mackinder, this is the third and most unpleasant aspect of his thinking. It's necessary to control Berlin. He who controls Berlin controls the heartland. He who controls the heartland controls the world island. He controls the world island controls the world. All right. That has been more or less the watchword of British and American geopolitics. You see it evident in the British moves in the 19th century to prevent Russia from expanding out of Central Asia into Afghanistan, into Persia, Iran, and so on. You see it in their opposition to the Russian approach during the war that brought about the Treaty of San Sebastian, when the Russian armies are literally at the gates of Constantinople, at the gates of Istanbul, and the rest of Europe says, stop, or otherwise there's going to be a general war. All right. You see it constantly in American geopolitics now, this need to prevent the expansion of Russia into those areas. So yeah, the domino theory, the way I'm approaching it, Daniel, whether or not we view the theory as valid is in a certain sense immaterial, since the policy forming elites in London, in Paris, in Wall Street, in the Pentagon, do seem to have been pursuing the basic outline, the basic tenets of this domino theory as outlined initially by Mackinder, and then dressed up in modern clothes by Zbigniew Brzezinski and people in the Council on Foreign Relations. So yeah, I think in that sense the domino theory is valid.
So then that brings me to a question I think you're going to enjoy.
Well, I'm enjoying all of them. I just wonder where this is going.
Well,
yeah, he's got that wicked laugh. Curl the mustache. Snidely whiplash.
That's right. Well, we do our best here to please. I'm gonna take a moment, and I'm going to try to put something up on the screen so people can just visualize what we're talking about. So give me just 1 second.
Sure.
I tried it and it failed the first time, so now I'm going to try again and see if I can make it happen. Yeah, I don't know that I can make it happen. I'm really trying to do it. Okay, so without being able to put something up on the screen for whatever reason this time, my question is this. First off, those of you that are on the show right now and can open another browser tab while you keep the show up and don't close it, may want to do a Google image search at images.google.com for Clash of Civilizations.
Mm-hmm.
And what you will find is a chart that Dr. Farrell has talked about in a lot of his blog posts, and something which I had occasion to study a great deal of in political theory graduate school, which is this chart from Samuel Huntington from Clash of Civilizations that shows various forces that it insists must ultimately go to war, come to a head, and result in essentially a state of perpetual conflict. And my question to you, Dr. Farrell, is does it strike you as odd that that particular chart by of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations that has the powers of African, Hindu, Islamic, Latin America, Western, Sinic, Orthodox, and Japanese lines up almost perfectly with the world island, offshore islands, and outlying islands of the heartland theory of Mackinder?
Yes.
They are almost one and the same. So here you have a group of people saying, if you want world domination, you have to control these regions. And they're saying that back at the end of the Cold War. And therefore, there's this domino theory where if one of them falls to us, if we lose it, we're likely to lose the next one. And the more modern peacetime theory that says, look, all of these guys are intrinsically in conflict, these particular exact forces, and necessarily war will be perpetual because it comes from this.
Mm-hmm.
Is that odd, or is that not surprise you?
No, that doesn't surprise me at all. I do think that to a certain extent, we have been watching this clash of civilizations being set up. And to a certain extent, we've also been watching the inevitable geopolitical conflicts emerge because of those civilizational differences. For example, Huntington, as you pointed out, mentions the Japanese as its own kind of self-contained culture. Well, I find it very interesting that Shinzo Abe's government in Japan has embarked on this Japanese rearmament program. They are the first so-called American puppet that has decided that they have to rearm. And I've been maintaining all along that this is simply not because of the spin that Washington and Tokyo are putting on it, that Japan is taking up more of the burden of its share of defense in the world as part of the American alliance system. I think that this is being done because Japan realizes that the American empire is in decline and they simply can no longer rely on America to represent Japan's best national and geopolitical interest. The same thing, I think, is going on with respect to the so-called BRICS bloc. If you look at the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, if you look at those nations geopolitically and culturally, they have nothing really in common with each other than a commitment to fight American unipolarism. Now, Russia, as far as I can tell, is the only country that has really been paying attention, not just to Samuel Huntington, but to the whole geopolitical, cultural conflict that's shaping up. Because Russia has very, very carefully avoided direct confrontation with the West in contested areas like the Baltic states, like the Ukraine. Putin has very, very wisely decided to let the West involve itself in those messes. His intervention in Syria is another signal that Russia's objectives geopolitically are very different than the West. Get in, inflict a military and economic defeat on who you want to harm, and then get out. They're not interested, in other words, in nation building. All right, they are playing a very, very careful, cagey game. But I do think, without any question, what Huntington has done, what Zbigniew Brzezinski did in the grand chessboard, and other thinkers like this, Francis Fukuyama being yet another, is that they have dressed up Halford Mackinder's theory in modern clothes and added the cultural part to something that Mackinder was only looking at from a purely geopolitical and economic point of view. But Huntington is saying that there are these clashes of culture, Islam, Orthodoxy, the West, the Hindu culture, and so on. And because of the cultural values of these civilizations, there's going to be constant conflict on these border areas. And that is key and crucial to understanding what I think is going to happen. Because, and taking Vietnam again as the model, if the United States attempts to use the Vietnam model in these border areas, it is, again, going to be a failure, and a huge failure, simply because the United States, being a secular Western culture, simply cannot understand. It almost has an innate inability to understand what is driving those other cultures, what's driving the Islamic culture, what's driving the Orthodox culture, what's driving the Japanese culture. After all of these years, our approach is still 19th century. Russia and China, you'll notice, are playing a very, very different game. They are playing a cultural game. They are building up infrastructure in the countries where they're closely tied, and they are presenting a clear contrast between their approach, building things, and the American approach, destroying things and sucking the wealth out of a country. So if we continue to play the game the way we've been playing it, I think we're going to lose. And if we continue, here's the big one, Daniel, and I hope I'm getting at what you're suggesting here. If we continue to play the game as we've been playing it, ultimately, we are going to lose Europe, both culturally and as allies. I think inevitably Europe is going to bolt. And Europe is going to bolt in two ways. They're going to sever their alliance contacts. They're going to build up their own military just for the same reasons that Japan has been doing. And they are going to go into a cultural reaction to defend European culture by any means necessary against any comers. And the principal comer right now, obviously, is the world of Islam. So right now it plays into America's hands, but it's not going to keep doing so.
Well, I want to.
Does that answer what you were getting at?
Does answer it, and so I want to point out that somebody else that we know is somebody else that we're very familiar with is interested in this issue of culture as a force of history in a geostrategic way. So what I have up, I don't know how well it can be seen by the viewers. What I have up here is Huntington's chart on one side and a little excerpt from Wikipedia from the pivot of history theory, also called the Heartland theory, on the other. And so you have to dig into the Wikipedia entry to see the countries it lists and see how well it lines up sort of with this chart, and see that what we may have here, and I actually want to bifurcate this into two different directions that I'm curious about, and then we'll go on to part two of our show, which is a totally different sort of direction in this discussion of Vietnam. But I want to point out that first, one group of people, well, let me start it this way. How am I going to say this? So first, James Billington, which we bring up a lot on this show, author of The Icon and the Axe, is making the argument in his interpretive history of Russian culture that that culture is the primary force in Russian identity and the primary explainer of Russian acts on the world political stage.
Yes.
A point that you've made on this show repeatedly. And we still see that in the present day Soviet Union, Putanic Union, that we have in the present day Russia, as well as China, those guys continually are articulating cultural arguments.
Yes.
Resistance to the West. They're saying, nope, your tyranny of commercialism is not going to be allowed to dominate the field in areas where we have influence, largely in the Middle East, but other places as well in East Asia. The Middle East is, if you get past the terror rhetoric and the burning of flags, you're getting the same thing. You're getting a culture argument, and it's a culture argument that even Noam Chomsky has pointed out is an argument of self-defense, very, very similar to what the Soviets are doing. The tactics are different. Obviously, the tactics are to be deplored, but the argument being made is almost identical to what the Russians and the Chinese are making by most of these sort of Muslim organizations.
Right.
The absolute fruit flies, which there's strong evidence were created by the West in the first place, aside. The more moderates who are chanting things in the street are saying, look, again, nationalists or tyrannical world hegemony of the U.S. Brit empire go away. And then now Europe is making this argument, as you point out, in the immigrant crisis. They're saying, hey, there is something called Europe that we cling to as a cultural identity.
Yes.
Everybody's making the argument from us, but us. I mean,
yes.
I remember that when I grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s and the 60s, in the late 60s, in that era, God, if you were from someplace else, if you lived in America's heartland in the Midwest, and there was some guy in school that was from Australia, or he was British, or he had a Zimbabwean accent, he was the cool dude, man. He was the guy that could get all the chicks. Even when he was in his 20s or 30s, he was doing okay. We romanticized anything foreign. We had people that would travel, they'd come back after backpacking through France, and suddenly they're Parisian, and they're sipping their coffee a certain way, and they're eating baguette every day, and there's almost a hunger, a starvation in
Yes.
the Midwest of the United States for something that is a coherent culture. And arguably, that transformed into the kind of expression we see in school shootings and things today, where people are like, look, I've got no cultural identity to cling to, and you're taking away even what I have. So everybody's making the culture argument, but us. And they're making the argument that this is not just a geostrategic argument, like you see in Huntington's chart or in the Heartland theory, but it's a geocultural strategic argument, that there
Yes.
are three things that go together. And so what I want to ask you about is, one, why? Why everyone but us? You and I are familiar from historiography of this what we call the imperial school of history, which says that America does have a culture. It simply is unwilling to own it, but that America is Europe. It is an offshoot of Europe. It is a European people. This is essentially a continuation of Great Britain, which is a continuation of Greater Europe. One, why do we have this problem that we don't have a culture? Number two, I mean, our culture is what? Fried chicken and and Axl Rose. Number two, yeah, monster trucks. And number two, why don't we go back and acknowledge our European or even just Anglo-Saxon roots?
Mm-hmm.
And finally, number three, why am I so suspicious when I see models like the Heartland theory and Huntington's civilization chart, because they remind me so deeply of what I saw in dispensationalism and their map of the future conflicts of the world that
Yes.
must happen before Christ can come back. What's
Yes.
going on with that?
Well, I think you finger part of the problem, a big part of the problem, when you mention dispensationalism.
I like to fix the problem.
Well, yeah, it is. We laugh, but it is true what you've said. If you look at American culture, I have always been one of those people of the opinion that American culture is primarily a Baptist culture. So in other words, when we look at Europe, we're seeing the effect, a profound long-term effect of the religious culture that formed it, both in the East and in Western Europe. And when you look at European Christianity, what people have to understand and don't understand, particularly in the United States, is that religion there was, number one, sacramental, and number two, it was ritualistic. In other words, it had a tradition that tied it to centuries of development and thought. You may disagree with that thought, but nevertheless, it's there, and even the disagreement is in opposition to it, all right? In America, if you look at the principal way that in the West now, most people think of Christianity in American terms, and in those terms, Americans, I have about 75 minutes, in America's religion, you have the Baptist religion. And what's the Baptist religion? Well, it tells you that you cannot be a Christian until you're an adult or at some level where you can make a rational decision to accept Jesus. So in other words, you're not a Christian tied to a tradition. You are taught Christianity in a revivalist mentality that rejects the traditional types of Christianity that you see in Europe, all right? In fact, it's almost drilled into you. And this has, in my opinion, a profound effect on American culture at large, because America doesn't view itself, at least most moderns don't view itself, as being part of a culture with a long heritage At best, most Americans think of, well, we had some problem with Great Britain a couple of centuries ago, and here we are, you know. But even then, they don't realize that Great Britain didn't just simply magically fall down out of heaven, you know, as a completed book like the Quran. It evolved over a long period of history of consideration of its political institutions, its religious institutions, its financial institutions. And most people forget, even the founding fathers, when they're trying to figure out at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, what are we going to model this on? Well, guess what? They turned to the Republic of Venice, of all things, to try and figure out, you know, how can we have a republic that balances competing factional interests? Well, they looked at Venice, believe it or not. And this grounds American culture in something much older than America. But when you have a religious presence in America that is constantly rejecting tradition, this manifests itself, I think, in the fact that American culture, you ask an American what their favorite music is, and they think of the Beatles as being classics, you know. European music and all of that, European art, European literature, that's completely out of the picture. And this, to my mind, Daniel, is very problematic because it means that culturally, the United States cannot, until it understands deeply and profoundly its cultural roots in European culture, that the United States cannot be a cultural leader of the West in the same way that a Britain was at one time, or that a France was at one time, or going even further back, that a Spain was, or an Italy or a Venice was. It certainly cannot be a cultural leader like Russia is for the Orthodox world. It cannot be a cultural leader like Japan was in the Far East, or China, representing a certain culture. So the United States, if it wants to play the culture game, it is going to have to get back and understand that it has some deep roots that transcend the founding of the Republic itself. And until it does, we are in a losing situation.
Well, Dr. Farrell, the only thing I can say to your comments about European pop music are, you've clearly forgotten Klaus from
Oh no.
because no one like you ride me like a hurricane. You forgot, because some of us are very loyal to Klaus. We follow the Moskva. Ride me like a... Anyway.
But no, I mean, seriously, I mean, go to Europe and, you know, sure, the French have their rock music, and the Germans have their rock music, and so on. But you ask an average Frenchman or German, you know, have you heard of Saint-Saëns? Well, of course they've heard of Saint-Saëns. You know, it's part of their culture. It's present to their mind in a way that it isn't present to an American mind. That's the problem. And I don't see that the United States is in a good position to play the cultural politics card like we see Russia and China playing it, because it is so locked after years of progressive education. And incidentally, I get into this very phenomenon in the Common Core book that you're talking about. It's been so locked into the progressive education theories and phenomenon, and culturally as part of the American civil religion, that we are an anti-tradition people. You know, if there's a traditional way of doing it, then we've got to invent our own way that's not traditional. This isn't going to work in a world where most of the societies are traditional. That's just the way it is.
Well, this is part of what happened when the Pope and the Patriarch, or I should say the Patriarch and the Patriarch, met. They essentially did some stuff in front of us that said, look, Europe is built on tradition, and here are these traditions, and you can't just invent You can't be on a particular political and social and cultural side in the United States and say, look, marriage is traditional, we got to go back to our traditions, and then just pick and choose which traditions that you want to adhere to. Well, yeah, but that's rooted in something. And of course, so what do you mean when you say it's traditional? You didn't invent that 500 years ago. But, on the musical side, Dr. Farrell, we all know your proclivities. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Smoking Beethoven. When his hair's on fire, Dr. Farrell's at the harpsichord. I've heard Dr. Farrell in a giant, enormous church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, doing mischief to their pipe organs. And I met him ages before I met him again, when he turned up to be my professor. I'm like, you're that crazy guy that used to run a music store, and you really like big pipe organs.
Yes, I do.
Big pipes, big artillery.
I was out of practice when
I don't know about that, but I remember walking in and asking some really dumb questions in the classical musical store that for one brief shining moment existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was like, where do I start? If I'm interested in classical music, you're like, I don't know. Do you like romantic? Do you like nationalist? Do you like Baroque? And I'm like, I don't know. It took me a while to learn that it was important to know something before you asked a question. That said, once again, ladies and gentlemen, Smoking Beethoven, hair on fire. have to have that image as we transition to part 2 of the show. Dr. Farrell, you usually need a break for iced tea or something at the show. Is this a good time for station?
This is a good time for
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll leave you with Smoking Beethoven while we go.
Oh my. Hmm.
Well, Dr. Farrell, we are back.
Thank goodness I don't have to look at Beethoven anymore. Oh, no.
Rockin' Beethoven now.
No.
Beethoven and Klaus.
Stop. Hurts the ears.
Can you just imagine if Beethoven, not Klaus, was the lead singer of the Scorpions? A whole different kind of European rock band.
Oh my.
I can just see it.
Yeah, I can too.
That's the disturbing part. Among. Well, Dr. Farrell, we're back for the rest of our show, and there's really 2 key areas I want to unpack. One of them, there's a significant part of the show. I have several segments lined up. So we did segment 1, segments 2 and 3. One segment has to do with Well, I'll bring it up because I want to surprise you. I like to see the look on your face. But the third segment has to do with media and psychology. So let's get into finish off the Vietnam War, and then we'll see where it leads us. Yeah, in psychology. So the area I want to bring up is war crimes, the issue of war crimes, because war crimes were charged throughout the war. And if you watch the video of the Dick Cavett show that we've been referring to, what Kerry is quoted as saying is war crimes in Vietnam are the rule, not the exception.
Right.
And of course, everybody can immediately cite the My Lai massacre. And of course, that's remembered differently in Vietnam. In Vietnam, it's remembered as two villages, and both within the same province, a province which had had a history of being brutalized and raped and so forth throughout the war. And the issue, of course, that we all remember is that after the Tet Offensive, military intelligence took a wild guess and said, well, the VC are probably hiding out in My Lai. And so they sent some people in, and they basically said, wipe everybody out. And so the American platoon of Charlie Company under Lieutenant Calley Jr. goes in, and they don't just wipe everybody out. I mean, the village is occupied mainly by, almost exclusively, there's reports say there wasn't a single male of military age. It was exclusively the elderly, children, very young children and infants, and young, very young women. And so there are systematic rapes followed by, murders in ditches and mass murder type stuff where they pile everybody in ditches and shoot through them, very much like the Belarusians or White Russians did in the previous war. In fact, the technique that's being used is drastically similar. When you read about the White Russians or the Belarusian SS, that book by Loftus, and you read about what they did, the atrocities committed by the Belarusian SS were considered so heinous that Himmler invented the gas chambers as a more humane alternative, because the German Nazis were disgusted at what the Belarusians had done, which is precisely to pile people in ditches and shoot through them to save bullets, killing man, woman, and child together. Shoot them as they're coming out, burn their houses, shoot them as they're coming out, et cetera, et cetera. So similar things were done, combined with rape at My Lai on a mass scale, 347 to 504 civilians, depending on whether you ask the US Army or the Vietnamese. And Lieutenant Calley is convicted and found guilty of killing 22 villagers, gets a life sentence, only serves 3.5 years under house arrest. This is part of the discussion, but it's part of this larger discussion of war crimes in Vietnam that take place in this debate on the Dick Cavett show.
Right.
And so what comes up in this debate is, what do we mean by war crimes? And what Kerry does in the debate is he reads a section from the Geneva Convention, and he defines war crimes as the Hague and Geneva and conventions define war crimes, and he brings them up and talks about the Nuremberg principles, and he uses the example of a free fire zone. And a free fire zone is one in which you can the military can expend artillery to wipe out absolutely everything in an area. If it moves, crawls, or flies, it's gone, and soldiers move in and kill anything that moves. And to quote it, this practice removes the distinction between combatant and non-combatant and contravenes the Geneva Convention. And so what happens, to give you just a little bit of background, is with the My Lai incident, it becomes the watershed moment where attention is drawn to this issue. Prior to this, there are lots of claims, but no one is really convicted. No great amount of media attention is brought to it. Robert McNamara orders the Inspector General of the Department of Defense to investigate press coverage of atrocities. And on August 1967, a 200-page report that starts with the title Alleged Atrocities is issued by the military, and it concludes that many American troops did not fully understand the Geneva Convention, but then no action was taken beyond that. But instead, what we get descriptions of these free fire zones and search and destroy missions, in which case they wipe out all the infrastructure. They burn the houses of peasants and villagers, etc. And some people have argued that the My Lai courts-martial against Cali and others failed to uphold the actual laws of war established at Nuremberg and at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and gave the example, and I'm going to read a quote. For example, Telford Taylor, senior American prosecutor at Nuremberg, wrote that the legal principles established at the war crimes trials could have been used to prosecute senior American military commanders for failing to prevent the atrocities such as the one at My Lai.
Yes.
So in other words, under the Nuremberg principles, it is not merely the man on the ground or the lone nut combatant that is guilty. It is the people in the chain of command that said, go in there and wipe out things and do your best, hurt them bad, that kind of stuff. And those people are liable. And so to continue, this quote, the U.S. Secretary of the Army, Howard Callaway, was quoted in the New York Times as saying that Callie's sentence was reduced because Callie, and again we're quoting, honestly believed that what he did was a part of his orders, a rationale that contradicts the standards set at Nuremberg and Tokyo, where following orders was not a defense for committing war crimes. It's the same thing Eichmann and everybody else argued, hey, we're just following orders, we're implementing the commands of our seniors. And on the whole, other than the My Lai courts-martial, there were 36 military trials held by the U.S. Army from January of 65 to August 73 for crimes against civilians in Vietnam. And most of them proceeded to have very light slaps on the wrist for the people on the ground and absolutely no punishment for the upper levels of command. So my question to you, Dr. Farrell, is, in your view, this was a hot issue being debated at the time in the 70s. And again, we're trying to get a feel for it. Were there war crimes in Vietnam? Were these war crimes? Are these war crimes? And why weren't the Nuremberg principles followed? And here's my clincher question I'm going to throw in for the sake of time for part of this. It strikes me that there's another area in which we only blame the lone nut on the ground. And that is not just in war crime situations in Iraq, which are they're very much similar to this. The descriptions are almost identical in some ways. And in Vietnam, but we do the same thing in the area of political assassinations. We cut off access to the hierarchy and say that it is the lone nut solely responsible, the one bad apple. My question to you, is there a link between these types of atrocities that we saw beginning at My Lai, or first documented at My Lai? There were atrocities in the Korean War too, but this was egregious at Vietnam. Is there a link between this and the assassination that brought about the escalation of the war,
Yes.
namely JFK's assassination?
Yes.
And again, were these war crimes?
Well, yes, I think absolutely they're war crimes. If you look, Daniel, at the West, it has had a history of hypocrisy when it comes to war crimes, because we're hanging Germans, we're hanging people like Colonel General Jodl, Field Marshal Keitel at Nuremberg. And in Keitel's case, I think the sentence was just. In Jodel's case, it could go kind of either way, but we're hanging Germans for their complicity in a hierarchy, in a regime that clearly is just executing people because it wants to get rid of them. But by the same token, you look at the behavior of the Western Allies during World War II. I view, by the same token, the firebombing of Dresden in February of 1945 as a war crime, simply because the Royal Air Force is literally wiping an entire city off the face of the map, firebombing it into oblivion, when it is no real military target and full of civilians, that are basically trying to flee from the Red Army. And of course, the British bomb it right off the map. So I view that as a war crime. But in Vietnam's case, I think what you're really asking, is there a connection between the war crimes that are committed in Vietnam and the hierarchy that is the deep state, so to speak, that murders President Kennedy? And I absolutely think that there is. And the reason why is, I've mentioned it earlier in this respect with Vietnam, is the American program called Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. Was a CIA program that literally drew up assassination lists of people that were targeted as enemies of American policy in Vietnam. And William Colby, who was in charge of that program, later, had kind of a deathbed confession, repentance moment when he deplored the whole action of that whole program. But literally, according to some accounts, there were as much as 30,000 people that were simply assassinated because they were on a death list that the CIA had drawn up. And what happens, if I remember correctly, in Operation Phoenix was that the cutouts there executing these people on these death lists were the South Vietnamese. In other words, again, the CIA was behind it, but you had proxies doing the actual dirty work on the ground. And that's a war crime. And the scale of it is, it's in the mass murder zone. And that's a war crime. So the West has a long history of this kind of hypocrisy. And again, the Germans didn't invent the concentration starvation camp. The British did during the Boer War, when they rounded up the Boers, put them in concentration camps, and basically gave them food rations that were not sufficient to sustain human life. So we have a long history of this kind of stuff. The real problem is that the deep state conducting this activity in Vietnam hangs people like Calley out to dry, or hangs people like Lee Harvey Oswald to take the fall for the entire murder of President Kennedy, and cloaks its own involvement in those activities. This is a pattern that repeats itself, unfortunately, all the way from Kennedy right up to 9/11. But absolutely, I think they're war crimes. There's no other way to define them. These people at My Lai were not a military threat. And you mentioned the strategic Hamlet concept earlier. And as far as I've been able to tell, Daniel, what these strategic hamlets were they were artillery bases, essentially. We'd fly in a bunch of artillery, we'd set up a fire command post, and these villages were able to dominate the surrounding regions simply with massive amounts of artillery fire and air power if something moved on the ground. And that, again, is kind of an indiscriminate use of firepower.
It's also potentially a war crime because
yeah.
it utilizes the peasants as human shields for your
Yes.
artillery embankments.
Yes, exactly.
Under the guise of we're going to protect them.
Exactly. So yeah, this is the persisting problem of war. How do you balance military security in a combat zone with war crimes? Does a nation have the right, if it's in a combat situation, to protect its military forces from insurgents, from partisans, from guerrillas? Well, certainly it does. But it's the question of the involvement of innocent civilian life. And sadly, the solution has always seemed to be, regardless of who's doing it, be it the Germans or the Russians or the British or whoever, the solution usually seems to be just go in and round up a bunch of people in a problem zone and shoot them. And that'll take care of the problem. And of course, it never really does, because you never get everybody. So yeah, that's a war crime. I don't see any other way to define it.
Well, it's certainly disturbing that in the United States, to merely, and it was true in the 70s, to merely say, yes, the U.S. commits routinely war crimes, is doing so, will get you hated, rockstar you, labeled un-American and a traitor, as though truth is not the most critical component, but simply fealty is.
Right.
And I can tell you that, I live in Brooklyn, and in New York City, which for those of you that don't know your way around New York, Brooklyn's part of New York City. It's 5 boroughs. Everybody's like, well, are you going to move to New York City? And I'm like, I'm in New York City. So spend some time here. It's worth your time. Get out to the outer boroughs. It's part of the city. But I live in Brooklyn, and the discussion in New York City is about, and I'm not taking a side, I'm saying this is what people are talking about. People are saying, look, there are two political parties in this country. One political party is about ideas and trying to define justice, whether you like it or not. whether you agree with them or not, and the other political party is about loyalty and fealty to the party. So it's polarized along a group where the Republican Party is essentially, hey, step in line, you go with the leadership, and the Democratic Party is all like, let's talk about how to make the world better, even though maybe we could argue they're not making the world better. So it's interesting that this mirrors this division that existed back then.
Yes.
Anybody who's ever watched the Archie, well, it's called All in the Family, but ever watched Archie Bunker, will know that even back in 1971, the division between the conversation was very much the same. There was a different tenor of the conversation, but people booed and hissed. People cheered their own team, right or wrong. And this brings up this issue of whether or not, and it was brought up by Kerry in the Dick Cavett show. He said there seems to be a mentality of our country, right or wrong, which is like my mother, drunk or sober. Like no matter what she does, no matter what my country does, I'm behind it. I will fall in line. I go with the leadership. I go with authority. We heard that at 9/11 when
Yes.
People all the way to the right, all the way to the left, people, the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, supported the war on terror, supported the invasion of Iraq, even knowing that it had nothing to do with 9/11, supported, torture techniques and all kinds of egregious things, and the rise of the security state, the Patriot Act, supported all this because there was this sort of everybody get in line behind the leadership. We don't question the president or question our nation's principles in a time of war. Right. Whereas the sort of non-neoliberals, the actual liberals, were saying that's precisely where you question it.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question to you that is not a political question, because we've hashed that out, and your listeners will fall into multiple categories, and you know who you are, whichever category you're in, it's your business. But what I want to ask you about, Dr. Farrell, is not left or right. I want to ask you is two things. A, do you think there is this mentality in our country of our country right or wrong? And where does it come from? It strikes me as being very familiar. And it strikes me as being very familiar because when I look at hey, the hierarchy is not responsible, I'm just following orders, I smell Richard Galen all the way. I smell the Nazis who made the same argument at Nuremberg. Yes. And when I look at the argument, my country, right or wrong, get in line behind the leadership, I think that the salute I want to make comes out from the chest and rises from there. It's not up here, on the forehead.
Yeah.
It's very Nazi smelling. So that the part B of this exact same question is, does this mentality exist? Am I right to sense where it may come from? Is it fascism?
Oh, yeah.
And is it, but this is the key, because it's being sold to us at times of stress as being part of the founding order of America. And it strikes me, and I want to ask you, is this truly American? Is this part of our founding principles as a people and a nation and a culture, that we simply get in line and follow authority, right or wrong, and that we don't speak against our government when it commits atrocities?
Well, let me begin by saying, when I watched the Cavett interview, I was struck by one overall thing. Other than the initial unpleasantness from Mr. O'Neill and his ad hominem attack on Mr. Kerry, both men during the interview conducted themselves more or less in a gentlemanly manner, particularly Mr. Kerry. Kerry was very patient. He suffered through all of the personal slurs and all of the attacks, and was trying to answer based on some issues. All right. Now you may disagree with Mr. Kerry, but at least he was trying to be a gentleman, and he managed to get O'Neill calmed down to the point that he could be a gentleman. We don't see that today in American politics. The loss of civility in this election, to my mind, is appalling. It does not represent the best of our tradition. I believe that courtesy is a fundamental prerequisite for any civilization, and particularly any republic, to survive. That said, this attitude of my country, right or wrong, I do think that is an incipient fascism that we have seen go absolutely off the charts since 9/11. I have a friend that it was involved professionally in the American intelligence community, and he sees the same thing happening in the intelligence community. And he was actually overseas when 9/11 happened, and he's told me that when he came back to this country after 9/11, he thought, what is this plastic patriotism that I'm seeing? Where is this mad rush? Where are the opposing voices? And the fact is that, as you've pointed out, there were none. There was this stampede into my country, right or wrong. And I do think, Daniel, I've said many, many times, I do think that this is a legacy, a bad one, of the dirty deals that we made with the fascist devil at the end of World War II. And let's recall, we had our own homegrown fascists that were making the deals. And they have adopted this attitude to the point, Daniel, that you cannot go to an American sporting event, baseball, football, what have you, where you do not get subjected to this orgy of a military spectacle, a quasi-military spectacle, the American version of the Nuremberg rallies, and, you know, airplanes flying by and support the troops, and so on and so forth, with unquestioning support. And that's what bothers me. How can you have, and I view it even from a simple military operational viewpoint, how can you have a successful military operation when the moral reasons for the justification are not present or discussed? At least during the Civil War, we had the pretense of a moral discussion, slavery versus states' rights. Now we've got nothing. We've got simply support the troops, support the government, support the leadership. And unfortunately, we know from history where this eventually ends up. It ended up that way with Rome. It ended up that way under Napoleonic France. It ended up that way with the Germans. It's not going to end up in any other way for us. If you cannot question authority, if you cannot have your own viewpoints, then the system has failed. And that's the problem that we're facing right now. And again, it goes back to what we've talked about before. I do smell, I've said it over and over again, we cannot make a move now without cameras on every stoplight, without having our emails read, without having our bank accounts scanned. And all of this is being done supposedly to protect us. And I say nonsense. It's to protect a corrupt, power-hungry elite. And when that happens, a system is headed either into revolution or into tyranny. And in both cases, it ends badly for the system. I smell the whiff of fascism in it. I cannot begin to tell. I mean, I look at one Republican candidate and I'm smelling fascism. I look at the two Democratic candidates and I'm hearing and picking up the distinct whiff of fascism, regardless of the rhetoric that they put their comments in. So yeah, I think we're in a very bad way. I don't see a good outcome to this, Daniel, unless people start waking up and realize that there is a culture here that is at stake, not only in the United States, but everywhere in the West.
I think that's really the challenge, because, you know, we're talking about an absence of culture, the inability to find a locus or something to hang our hats on and base it on as an American culture that isn't tacos and French fries, none of which are Mexican. Well, I guess tacos, Tex-Mex tacos aren't Mexican. But come to New York, I'll show you a real taco. Anyway, come to the taco trucks here, and if you're used to Tex-Mex, you're like, what is this? And it's like, that's actually what a taco is. But, you know, there's a couple of quotes I want to read just for the sake of the show, and then I want to pivot a little bit. Harry Truman, America was not built on fear, it was built on courage. And so there's a difference of getting a nation so terrorized and so afraid that it reacts with violence like a cornered animal, and with violations of its own ethical rules, and having the courage to face an enemy without those violations. So that's an approach from Harry Truman. And then this one may be surprising. This is Emmylou Harris. And for those of you under 20, sorry, but you'll just have to enjoy her music on YouTube. Patriotism can be good or bad. Knee-jerk patriotism can be very bad. I'm patriotic almost to the point of self-consciousness, but I love my country the way I love a friend or a child who I would correct if she was going the wrong way, and who I expect the very best from.
Hear, hear.
So, and that, by the way, if we talked earlier about being a gentleman, that's a lady.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Exactly.
so I want to draw on this because I'm torn between which way to pivot. I want to deal with the civilization and cordiality and loss of civility issue, and I have that slated for the last part of the show. But so I think I'm going to save it because you're just tempting me really hard to pivot in another direction based on what you said to my question, which is, you talked about this going to a sporting event. And people, and for me, it's movies. I'm in the middle of a movie about Selma, and it's like, we are the American military. Join up now, but at least don't argue with us. That's basically a trailer in the middle at the beginning of my movie. I'm like, what's that got to do with Selma? In fact, it may be the opposite of what we, do you know what the National Guard was doing? So anyway, I look at that though, and I can't help but think, if you look at political correctness on the left in the 1990s, which is for those who remember it, it was egregious. It was to the point where you couldn't say anything. You go to work, you could be fired for looking at a woman the wrong way, or a man the wrong way, or whatever, or making a very offhand joke. I remember growing up, it was okay to say to a woman, "Wow, you've got nice legs," without going to jail or something. I mean, yeah, maybe there's a time and a place. Don't say it to the preacher's wife in the middle of the service, but it's, wow, lady. But political correctness became extreme, and the problem most of us had with it, even on the left, people were like, "This is crazy," is that it put everybody. It required you to all have unified thought. We all think one thing, and we all think it to the maximum extreme that you can think it. Yeah. And if you don't do that, you're not loyal to liberal principles. And that's crazy because that's the opposite of liberalism. And then on the other side, you get the rise of the Republican right beginning at exactly the same moment, late 80s, early 90s, and this sort of cultural fascism of, hey, it's our party. You got to be loyal to our group. We'll take a conservative who doesn't even agree with our principles, who's pro-abortion, but he's a Republican. We'll get him in there because we'll switch him. Or he's pseudo-Christian, but we want him. I mean, it was a weird time. For those who don't remember, who weren't listening to talk radio back then, I'm sorry you missed out. But it struck me, Dr. Farrell, that you're describing this. You're onto it, and what you're describing from our days in philosophy strikes me as cultural monotheism.
Yes.
Somehow, if we were to put this in religious terms, the religious equivalent of political correctness or of fascism is monotheism. It is the reduction of everything to a single principle, which, for those of you who don't know, not all Christians are monotheists. That's a particular theory within Christianity, within later Christianity. So as I look at this monotheism, it's asking us, and you said it at sporting events, we're asked to unite over our troops and then go back to dividing over our teams, our political party, and our brands. And if you remember what we studied, when we studied theology and the cultural and historical and political significance of theology from ancient times to the present day, we said that represents something. When you ask somebody to unify over one thing and then immediately break up, it represents this dialectic that you talk about in your earlier theological works.
Yes.
So my question to you is that what we're seeing? Is cultural monotheism ruining our ability to be civil to one another and to have a real discussion of what it means to be an American and create a culture? Has it destroyed our culture by reducing us culturally to some single principle that can't sustain itself?
Yeah. What you have is you have the removal, as I indicated earlier, you have the removal of the idea that the United States is a continuation, essentially, of a tradition. So once you remove tradition from the picture, you have to replace it with something. So you replace it with an artificial authority that dictates the cultural norm. Okay, once that process gets underway, you pointed out the political correctness movement, which I would say is alive and well, particularly in the universities. What happens, as you say, is everybody's got to think the same way, and you lock everybody into a position of fear where they can't say anything lest they offend somebody. We've got to learn to grow up. That was part of the tradition. Being a little tough.
I can't question the wisdom of cutting off your genitals and dressing like the opposite sex without somebody saying I'm intolerant merely for raising the question of
The question, exactly.
It makes me a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, we've got to get back to the idea that we've got to have tough skins, whether we're on the extreme left or the extreme right, and be able to let people articulate a position or an opinion. And we've got to get back to the idea. This is what struck me about the Cabot interview. Clearly, O'Neill and Kerry disagreed with each other profoundly, but they would let each other talk. And they weren't, other than that initial set of ad hominems from O'Neill, they weren't calling each other names simply because they disagreed with each other. And they weren't taking offense at what the other person was saying.
They weren't even William F. Buckley
No.
Aggressive. You know, William F.
Right.
Buckley question your ancestry and call your mother a whore in the politest way possible. And you'd feel like it was a privilege to shake his hand, you know? It wasn't even that far. They were kind of nice to each other in a way.
Yeah. What has happened now is we have accepted a whole host of historical narratives about the country and about various people at various times that simply are not true. We are no longer willing to dig in our scholarship. We are no longer willing to tolerate extreme disagreement on some issues. So the problem is authority steps in, like you say, to impose an authority. Here, accept the military, and then go out and disagree with each other. We're not even at that stage anymore. And when discussion, when free speech breaks down under an ideology of supposed tolerance or not being willing to offend somebody, then free speech has ended and tyranny begins. And I'm sorry, I'm one of those people that places more value in individual freedom. Notice I didn't say liberty. This is another thing that bothers me. You know, liberty is shore leave. It's what the authorities give you. I'm for freedom. And free speech is the bedrock, one of the bedrocks of our evolved civilization. And if we don't protect it, then we're going to lose it. And I see nothing in the current debates politically in this country. I see nothing culturally in this country that indicates that anybody on a national scale is willing to defend the idea of free speech. It's all agree with the government. It's agree with your party. You know, we have to get away from this idea that we label ourselves. You know, I don't even know how to label myself. I'm partly a progressive, I'm partly a libertarian, and I'm partly a conservative. And, you know, all three of those groups would hate me for some of my ideas. And that's the problem. We've got to get out of this idea of labeling ourselves, because once you do, you become part of that dialectic. And the problem is, Daniel, dialectic cannot handle an individual free person. That's the problem. It can only deal with the collective. We have in this country adopted collective mentalities and methods at almost every level. You see it particularly in the educational system. And we've got to get back to the tradition. And the tradition is that you defend a point of view with the full intellectual rigor that you are able to muster. And if people are offended, then let them defend their position with full intellectual rigor and muscle, rather than try and shut down someone else's free speech. That's the bottom line.
Well, to the list of your political
Oh,
proclivities,
jeez.
I just want to mention Hogwarts as, as being a part of, clearly, by your dress and mode and mannerisms, Dr. Farrell. Clearly Hogwarts. Well, there's another quote I'll just throw out there on the table. Harry Emerson Fosdick. He is a poor patriot whose patriotism does not enable him to understand how all men everywhere feel about their altars and their hearthstones, their flag, and their fatherland.
Right.
So he's obviously stating that patriotism is meant to make us understand others, not just understand ourselves. So it's not a narcissistic force in the original conception. So, Dr. Farrell, I want to ask you about the potential, the alleged cover-up. Which, on this show, do we even have to say alleged when we use the term cover-up? I mean, we assume there's a cover-up in almost everything. So in that vein, I want to read some quotes. So initially, 3 servicemen had tried to halt the My Lai massacre, and they were and rescue hiding civilians, etc. And they were denounced as traitors by several U.S. congressmen, including Mendel Rivers, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Only after 30 years were they recognized and decorated, one posthumously by the U.S. Army for shielding non-combatants from harm in a war zone. So this kind of goes along with, you're with us or you're against us, the us and them thing. And here are the 3 quotes. 6 months later, Tom Glenn, a 21-year-old soldier of the 11th Light Infantry Brigade, wrote a letter to General Creighton Abrams, the new overall commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. He described an ongoing and routine brutality against Vietnamese citizens on the part of American forces in Vietnam that he had personally witnessed, and then concluded, "It would indeed be terrible to find it necessary to believe that an American soldier that harbors such racial intolerance and disregard for justice and human feeling is a prototype of all American national character. Yet the frequency of such soldiers lends credulity to such belief. What has been outlined here I have seen not only in my own unit, but also in others we have worked with, and I fear it is universal. If this is indeed the case, it is a problem which cannot be overlooked, but it can, through a more firm implementation of the codes of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam and the Geneva Conventions, perhaps be eradicated." Out of 3, quote number 2. In 1967, an American journalist, Jonathan Schnell, wrote that in the Vietnamese province of Quang Ngai, and I can't pronounce this stuff to save my life, but where the My Lai massacre occurred, up to 70% of all villages were destroyed by the airstrikes and artillery bombardments, including the use of napalm. 40% of the population were refugees, and overall civilian casualties were close to 50,000 per year in that province. Regarding the massacre at My Lai, he stated, "There can be no doubt that such an atrocity was possible only because a number of other methods of killing civilians and destroying their villages had come to be the rule and not the exception in our conduct of the war." And lastly, quotation number 3, in May 1970, a sergeant who participated in Operation Speedy Express wrote a confidential letter to then Army Chief of Staff Westmoreland, later known as General Westmoreland, describing civilian killings he said were on the scale of the massacre occurring at My Lai each month for over a year during 1968 to 1969. 2 other letters to this effect from enlisted soldiers to military leaders in 1971, all signed Concerned Sergeant, were uncovered within declassified National Archive documents. The letters describe common occurrences of civilian killings during population pacification operations. Army policy also stressed very high body counts, and this resulted in dead civilians being marked down as combatants. Alluding to indiscriminate killings described as unavoidable, the commander of the 9th Division, then Major General Julian Ewell, in September 1969, submitted a confidential report to Westmoreland and other generals describing the countryside in some areas of Vietnam as resembling the battlefields of Verdun. And so if you're familiar with that part of history, speaking to the audience, we're talking about extreme numbers of deaths, obviously supporting the view that the military is being successful in Vietnam because we have such a high Viet Cong body count, because we're counting unarmed peasants as Viet Cong. So my first question there is, Was there an Army cover-up? That's, I think, the obvious question, but keep in mind that in 1970, that would be a question. Was there an Army cover-up? And is the Army's decision not to maintain a body count of non-combatants in Vietnam? They specifically decided we're not going to count them anymore. Is that essential? Is that de facto a cover-up simply by omission?
Oh yeah, I number one, I definitely think that there was and to a certain extent still is, a cover-up of the actual numbers of civilians that were killed as part of military operations in Vietnam. And I'll go further. I think that this has been consistent policy of cover-up that has been continued to this day. Because you look at Iraq, for example, and the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and there is a consistent disconnect between the figures that the U.S. military puts out and the figures that you find in the alternative media of actual Iraqi civilian deaths as a result of the West, of American and Britain invading Iraq. I think this is a consistent policy. So yes, I think that there's a cover-up that went on in Vietnam of exactly how extensive the civilian casualties, not just in South Vietnam, but I would add as a result of the bombing campaign in North Vietnam, as a result of Nixon's so-called secret bombing of Laos and Cambodia. All right, I think that was consistent. But the other thing that disturbs me is probably something that you didn't intentionally intend to do in your remarks, and that is you coupled the body count idea of Vietnam with the Battle of Verdun in World War I, which was just an absolute slaughterhouse for both the Germans and the French. And what's interesting is you look at the mentality of the U.S. military in Vietnam, and I remember this very vividly. You know, I grew up in the 60s. I watched this happen, and every night on the CBS Evening News, there would be a report by Walter Cronkite or whoever was substituting for him. So many Americans killed today, so many enemy. And the emphasis of the military was, we're winning because we're killing more of the enemy. So it was all body count. It was all brutal, gruesome kill ratios and statistics, which to my mind, you know, that returns us to World War I. This was exactly the mentality of the generals on the Western Front. How many can we kill and keep our losses down? And if we kill enough and keep our losses down, then we're going to win the war. You know, it was a brutal, bloody strategy of attrition. And in both cases, World War I and World War II, it didn't work. At no time. You know, I'm one of these military history buffs that just has been unconvinced that kill ratios are an indicator of, pardon me, who's going to win the war. The German kill ratio in World War II was phenomenal right up to the end of the war, and they still lost.
Only in video games does that.
Yeah, only in video games does that work. So, you know, the mentality at the time, Daniel, was, you know, put out the body count and cover up. Yeah, because no one to this day knows exactly how much the Vietnamese really lost. And that goes back to what I said earlier. The whole strategy to me, just looking back at it, Daniel, seems like the whole intention was just to blow the country apart and reduce it to a pile of rubble, so that, you know, when we cut it loose and said, you know, we're washing our hands of it no more, go your communist way, Vietnam was not in any position to be rebuilt by the Chinese. And, you know, the Vietnamese and Chinese don't like each other to begin with. Russia wasn't going to help and couldn't help. So, you know, Vietnam was basically left to turn right back to the people that had blown it right off the map. So the whole thing, I think to this day, to be quite blunt with you, Daniel, the whole thing to this day, I think there's aspects of it that are still covered up. Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind.
Well, I want to, I guess I'll pivot there because I still want to get back to this issue that you just raised again. There's some other stuff I want to ask you about. We'll see if we have time. But for now, let's go back to the alternative reasons for the war. If we dismiss the policy of containment, we dismiss caring about people and their freedom. and to the point of the cover up, by definition, the Pentagon Papers reveal a cover up.
Oh, absolutely.
So the Pentagon Papers show that the war is far more expanded with secret bombings and things, and that we deliberately provoked the North Vietnamese. The CIA had a policy of trying to create large-scale American intervention in the war. So they bombed North Vietnam and attacked supply routes and depots, and they created incursions, anything they could to provoke a North Vietnamese retaliation. And of course, that stuff came out, and Daniel Ellsberg had to flee in the same way that Bradley Manning, and other whistleblowers have been threatened. And Nixon suppresses this information in the newspapers at the time, and to our shame as a nation, our absolute shame, some newspapers went along with it, but for a while. But ultimately, it came out, I think, in the New York Times. The equivalent of their breaking of Watergate with Woodward and Bernstein. And I look at this and I think, all right, what do these people stand to gain by escalating the war? And it's deeply suspicious to me. I don't believe you can even just come through as a wet behind the ears, barely educated American school kid and not, unless all you did was answer the test questions on a multiple choice, and not be deeply suspicious at the scale of the war and the amount of munitions expended, the number of people killed, and not think something else is going on.
Yep.
So my question is this: huge destruction of infrastructure, huge destruction of human life. And I mean, specifically aimed at depopulation. That's the first time that the United States really has engaged in an express policy of depopulation. That's so totalitarian and evil and sinister to even talk that way, let alone to have a policy behind it. My thoughts are these, and I want to run them by you and see, if this was my multiple choice in high school, if I was writing for high school students, I would ask the following question: which of the following are causes of the war in Vietnam? A, to sell more munitions because we want to drop as many munitions as possible, and we are heavily financially invested in the munitions industry. B, to create a client state with a positive net trade result for the United States. We got to wipe out their infrastructure, turn them into a third world country because we need suppliers, and we live on a supply chain economy that says, hey, you create the supply, Americans will supply the demand. And C, we want to make this country unrebuildable for the Soviets and the Red Chinese. We want to leave them a worthless country because that's the opposite of a neutron bomb. And a neutron bomb, you depopulate and you leave them with all the infrastructure intact. What we want to do is wreck the infrastructure because we know we can't keep it from the communists, but what we can do is deprive them of a victory, even if they win the ground, which they probably will. D, all of the above. Dr. Farrell, you're the high school boy in class. How do you answer this?
Oh, easy. I can tell you how I would have answered that right away. I would have said D, all the above, because I remember, Daniel, growing up during that period, hanging over all of us at that time was the idea that we'd be drafted and sent off to some jungle to fight a war that had never really been declared by the Congress, that clearly the military had no objective there other than to kill lots of Vietnamese. But the objective wasn't, let's win the war, because of the policy of containment. Let's just fight the war and keep it going for as long as we can. I remember arguing with my dad over and over and over about this, that, he grew up in the World War II generation, that by golly, when your country calls on you, you better, off you go. But, we weren't fighting Adolf Hitler or Hideki Togo in Hanoi. We were fighting Ho Chi Minh. And there was no threat to the United States or its military or national security from Ho Chi Minh. There was from Adolf Hitler, to be sure. So, I'm not a pacifist by any stretch of the imagination, but I had no difficulty at that time thinking and seeing that this was really a war just to make a lot of people rich. And, it falls into what Catherine Fitz calls the central bank welfare warfare model. It's welfare for big corporations. And the problem is that Vietnam, in a certain sense, Daniel, was what President Eisenhower warned us about with the military-industrial complex, that it would simply grow so big that it would demand to be fed. And, you know, the problem that the United States, like every other empire that has preceded it, it gets into a position where the military becomes the predominant means of national wealth and income, just like it did for the British Empire, just like it did previously for the French, for the Spanish, for Venice, and so on and so forth. And at a certain point, that system always implodes. And this is the problem that we're faced now. The problem is that we've made probably more enemies out of our empire than any previous empire in existence. It's going to be very, very difficult to turn this thing around. But Vietnam, absolutely, all four of them, all four of them.
And I guess if we had to add one more, we could say F the heroin trade. But
yeah, exactly, exactly. Restructure the drug trade. Restructure the drug trade.
And also create a steady stream of new customers by creating addicts over there.
Exactly, exactly. Gary Webb has documented some of this. There's a movie out by Robert Altman. Since we're talking about this period of history, if people don't know this movie, I actually played it for a good friend of mine who's a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, good friend of mine from college days. And I asked him, you know, to watch this movie with me and give me his impressions. And he just sat through the whole thing. And at the end of it, he turned to me and he said, "Holy cow, that explains the whole thing better than anything I've seen." The movie is a Robert Altman film called Secret Honor. And it's about Richard Nixon and the inside story of Vietnam and Watergate. And it's actually based on a column by a Democratic columnist at the time by the name of Renata Adler, who put all this together and wrote her column. And then after that, she sort of fell right off the radar screen. It brings all of what we're talking about into the picture: the drug trade, the secret deals, the corporations, the Eastern establishment, the whole nine yards. It's quite a tour de force.
Yeah, I think I've seen it, but I can't remember. But I'll have to go back and take a look. So we have more questions. We have time. So what I'm going to do is quickly outline the questions that I have, so that people know sort of what I'm thinking, and they may be able to hit you up with these in the chat. But I also want to leave time then for getting the answers to at least one or two of them. So let me mention the questions I have in mind. So first, I'm going to read one last quote and quotation, as I was taught to call it in Dr. Farrell's papers. You have to put quotation at the end of it, or you get marked down.
That's right.
I still do it. I've yielded, Dr. Farrell. I get so tired of trying to explain now to people in my email life what a quotation is.
Yes.
That I just go ahead and put quote rather than have to have another email saying what I mean by quotation. But but you know,
quotation is the noun, quote is the verb. I mean, it's that simple. But anyway, go ahead.
Exactly. Or the mark, the punctuation. So here you go. Lawrence LaCroix, a squad leader in Charlie Company at My Lai, stated in 2010. A lot of people talk about My Lai and they say, well, you know, yeah, but you can't follow an illegal order. Trust me, there's no such thing. Not in the military. If I go into a combat situation and I tell them, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to follow that order, well, they put me up against the wall and shoot me. And I remember I had a family member in Vietnam, and I remember talking to him, and he's like, yeah, you can't really refuse to follow orders because they put a gun to your head in Vietnam. They don't, it's not like a clean, honorable sort of above ground war. It's a more subterranean environment where you frag people who are superiors if you don't trust them or you think they'll get you killed or if they're too demanding. You shoot soldiers that are equals or below you if they don't follow orders or if you're worried they're going to get you killed. There was wholesale sort of evaporation of life there that was killed by friendly fire. There's even some suspicion, certain people that were speaking out about war crimes there had mid-air collisions and were no longer available for testimony, et cetera. I'm a little suspicious about that. Just, it's hard to be, we didn't think that way in the 70s, but now we do. So I look at that, and they asked Kerry, Kerry's opponent asked him why there are so few depositions of atrocities, why nobody will go on record and sign a deposition. And Kerry essentially said that these men don't come back to turn on their own. that they're not trying to out other men. They're trying to call attention to the overall problem. That may be one answer, but I can't help but think of this answer where you get put up against a wall and shot as potentially a peacetime concern as well as a wartime concern. You know, I knew a lot of men that came back from Vietnam when I was a kid, and they brought their weapons with them. They had footlockers in their houses with an amazing assortment of weaponry that came from Vietnam, both captured and personal. It was a little bit of a cowboy war, even more so than Afghanistan. So I was thinking about that, wanted to ask you about it, but also I wanted to ask you whether we've forgotten the lessons of Vietnam and why. You know, because it seems like we're repeating the same things over and over again. And the easiest way is to go, yes, of course we've forgotten. But when I see somebody banging their head against a door over and over and over again, there's two assumptions. One is the person has forgotten what just happened a second ago. And the other is it's by design. In other words, we're supposed to forget. We want to keep doing this because the objective we have in mind we're not trying to bang our way through the door. We're trying to create some other effect, and whatever we're doing is working. In other words, is the reason that we have forgotten if we've forgotten the lessons of Vietnam and we keep repeating them, is the reasons we've forgotten them simply because we're after something else and that something is working. And the last two areas of question, and I'm just hitting these highlights and I'm going to come back. So I have two areas. One is in 2004, Kerry ran for president, and David Rents says he actually won. That votes in Ohio weren't counted. People thought they had voted for Kerry, and their votes didn't count, and they were thrown out. And provisional ballots were handed out like candy, and that Kerry, not Bush, actually won the presidency. And I'm wondering whether you put any stock in that, and what that may have to do with the perpetuation of war since the Kennedy administration. And lastly, the area that I want to make sure I ask you about. So this will be question number one. So I'm just sort of doing it in reverse. And I can regurgitate any of these to you, Dr. Farrell. I just want to get them on the video record. But this is where I really wanted to get. So I'm going to ask it this way. What is different about this show, this episode of the Dick Cavett Show, and the current fare that we see on TV these days? If we try to watch a serious talk show about the issues on TV, if we can even find one, or on the internet, all I can find now, I don't find anything like this. The McNeil-Lehrer report is gone. Crossfire is gone, with Buckley, and I don't see anything. I can't get this from Letterman or Jay Leno. I see a dumbing down of public conversation. You mentioned personal attacks versus addressing the issues, the loss of civility. Even in the 70s there, in 1971, there was booing, there was some audience misbehavior. They did allow an extended 45-minute ad hominem from the guy, but it was still far advanced over current conversation. When I look at, I was not disappointed so much by how bad it was on that show, on that episode of Dick Cavett. I was impressed by, despite the stuff I saw that still exists today, how good it was. And if there were shows like that on TV every Saturday night, I'd be glued to the TV. And I think you would too. So where is it? Why is it gone? Why is there such an egregious difference?
Well, the lack of civility and the egregious difference between American political discourse now compared to back then. Even back then, I think it was already in a period of decline, because you notice that the show began with O'Neill launching nothing but kind of a personal slur attack against Mr. Kerry. But
poisoned the well.
Yeah, he almost poisoned the whole discussion. But Kerry and Cavett managed to bring him, back down to a less emotional plane where they could actually have a discussion. Daniel, I strongly suspect that the reason that the discourse is so low, and you put your finger right on it, the reason that the discourse is so low is that by and large, the population now is even stupider than it was back then. And it was already getting pretty bad back then.
Well, just to clarify, there's two ways you could have gone with this. You could have claimed that it's bad because we're dumber and there's no demand for this kind of show, or you could have claimed that we're just as smart, and they're keeping this show away from us and giving us shit, even though we really don't want it. But you feel it's the one, or you feel it's both of those, or
It could be both of those. I do think that there's a segment of the population that would appreciate a show like that. But the problem is, as I said many times to my late friend George Ann Hughes, the problem is that even the elite, the so-called elite, is now much stupider than it was back then.
That's encouraging anyway.
well, the problem is, I pointed this out many times. The elites surround themselves with yes men. They surround themselves with people that agree with their own position. And you can only do that so long before you run out of the ability to create or generate different approaches to problems. And this is what we see going on. I hear over and over from people, Daniel, all the time that they're following the same playbook, and it's now transparent. We get it. And, the reason they're losing control is they don't know any other way to approach things. And this is why you see them in kind of a state of panic. They are themselves the victims of their own dumbing down process. So I view it as somewhat of a vicious circle. But I do think that in the main, the modern American population is, I looked at the audience when the camera was panning in the Cabot audience. I was looking at the audience in particular to notice some things. Number one, they were all nicely dressed. They were nicely groomed. They weren't there in casual clothes. Carey and O'Neill and Cabot had on suits. The ladies in the audience, for the most part, were, they had on dresses. The men, for the most part, had on suits. You look at an American audience today, and they could care less. In other words, we've lost the idea that there are special occasions that you present the very best face for yourself that you can. That means dressing up. American culture has leveled everything. This is part of that anti-tradition. We have no hierarchy of values. We have no hierarchy of beauties. We have no hierarchy of virtues anymore. Everything has been leveled to the lowest common denominator.
Well, you're talking about something that existed in the 60s and 70s.
Yes.
You and I remember you dressed up when you felt like you were going to something.
Exactly.
You respected the thing you were going to.
Right, exactly. And we don't do that anymore because we've leveled everything. And this is one of the most persistent features of modern American cultures. The second thing that I think has happened in this dumbing down process is, and again, I talk about it in the Common Core book that's coming out, believe it or not, in relationship to education. What we've created is we've created a culture of consumers. So in other words, because of this, every American now is living more or less simply to keep their belly full and have their football games and their cable TV and so on and so forth. It's essentially a narcissistic culture. And when you're living in that kind of culture, we saw what it did in Rome. We saw again what ultimately happened to Venice in feeding that kind of culture. They collapse because there's nothing other than the transcendence, so to speak, of the self that matters. And this is also what's driving the current discourse. I'm embarrassed, quite frankly. If I were living in Germany or Norway or Canada, looking at the United States and this political selection cycle, I'd be embarrassed for this country, because the rhetoric and the tone is so absolutely far afield from any real political discussion and in-depth probing of issues. We have staged political debates right now that are not political debates. They're really designed to keep the political candidates from having any real genuine contact with the people. And that's the other part of the problem. There is no real vehicle where there is a connection between the electorate and the political candidate. If this is all orchestrated, it's all stage managed, it's all theater, and it's no wonder the people feel totally disconnected from the process, because they are. Imagine Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or Ted Cruz having to field a real question, not pre-selected, not prepared for by the audience. You go to Russia, on the other hand, you go to Russia and you look at those press conferences with Vladimir Putin talking with ordinary people with unsolicited, unprepared questions, and he's talking for over an hour with people, giving long, elaborate, unprepared for, no teleprompter answers. And the difference is there, right there. So, you know, people wonder, why is Putin so popular? Go figure. Think about it. Because he's actually trying to make contact with the people of Russia and giving his responses and answers. And some of the questions he's being asked are very pointed. So there's every difference in the world. And I forgot what the second question was. There was another question I wanted to respond to as well, besides the civility question, and I forgot what it was. Oh, the election, the election fraud in Ohio. I have to comment on that because, as you know, I'm not a big Kerry fan. I'm certainly not, I wasn't a big George Bush fan. Daniel, I got to tell you, when I blog on this website, I oftentimes call it the presidential selection cycle, and I'll put S in parenthesis in front of the word election, because this is what I think has really happened to American politics. There's no doubt in my mind that the 2000 election, with the big scandal that we had in the state of Florida over hanging Chad and those computerized ballots, that this was a deliberately concocted constitutional crisis, number one. Number two, that probably Vice President Gore actually won the election, both in the popular and in the electoral vote. And there's no doubt in my mind that the reason that they did this was they needed a candidate in office that would respond appropriately for the 9/11 operation. In other words, I think this is intimately connected to 9/11. So with Kerry in 2004, I think essentially you had, number one, a fix was in at the outset. You had two skull and bones candidates, in other words, neither one of whom wanted to talk about it. But Kerry, there's no doubt in my mind that the election was stolen from him because, again, Kerry is the other side of the factions of the American political deep state that was looking at all of this, the war on terrorism, the surveillance state, and so on and so forth, and thinking there's got to be a better way than this. You see this now that he's Secretary of State, going around the world trying to diffuse all of these situations that the other faction has created. So there's no doubt in my mind that that was a stolen election. It was a fixed election, and it was part of the plan, so to speak, in 2000. He had to lose that election. They had to have Bush in for another term. This is why I don't vote.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Yeah, so all right. Some of these other questions, there was a couple of other questions, but your listeners can bring those up in the vid chat if they want to pick your brain for it. We got to the main part of the show, so I'm pretty happy with it. Dr. Farrell, it's been a rip roar.
Yeah, good show. I was really wondering where you were going to take this.
Well, I hope you liked the format.
Yeah, I did.
I tell you what happened was I saw that episode, and I was on Hulu. I was flipping through old shows, and I came across it, and I thought, oh, I'll watch this. And I was blown out of my chair by the substance of the show before me. I hadn't seen anything like that since seeing Buckley on Firing Line or something like that, or it was a Crossfire Firing Line, I can't remember. But I just was stunned by it, and I thought it's wrong that I can't get this kind of TV anymore about current issues that are going on. And so I watched it 4 more times and sent it to you and said, hey, we got to do a show about this, not just about the topics, but about how they're handling their show.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. We don't have the William Buckleys. We don't have McNeil Lehrer. All of these old commentary shows are gone. And political discourse in this country, I think, has suffered because of it. We need a good kind of center libertarian type of show that's not committed to either political party doing something like this. And Cavett was always the quintessential gentleman. And Uh, he had his own kind of wry sense of humor. This is totally missing. I mean, my word, what we have now is Megyn Kelly and Bill O'Reilly, and this isn't political commentary. It's just put out the agenda, put out the talking points, and that's it. And
Right. Well, for those of you that want to make your kids roll their eyes or scare the hell out of them, drag them to the TV, sit them down, pull up June 30th, 1971 of the Dick Cavett show on Hulu and say, this is on Hulu. Mom and Dad are only going to make you watch one episode. And after that, we just want you to know what TV, the intellectual powerhouse that TV once was. And then you can go back to your SpongeBob.
That's right. That's exactly.
Daniel,
I'm so disgusted with TV, and even for that matter, radio. I don't have my television cable hooked up. I haven't for months. I haven't since I've been back. I talk radio I used to listen to regularly. I can't stand it now. I barely listen to it. I can barely stand it. There's no deep philosophical discussion, and you can't. The problem is we can't even find it on the university campus anymore because they've become so, they're degree mills, they're indoctrination centers. There's nothing like this really going on anywhere. That's to our loss.
Well, I just want to say that when we're starving, we reach for things that are not good for us. We reach for the ho-hos and the Hostess Twinkies,
and that's what we're getting.
And what I find, where I'm going with that is, whether you're on the left or the right, or you're actually a thinking person, in which case you disavow those associations, you look at somebody who is a modern day Archie Bunker, who just listens to who are these guys, Rush Limbaugh and Hannity and all of this.
Mm-hmm.
You wonder, why are they doing this? But imagine if you sucked all of the intellectual content out of a country, and then you said the only place you can find anything like a discussion of issues is going to be completely one-sided. It's bad for you, it's unbalanced, it's unnutritious, it's highly distorted, but it's the only food in the room. Now we're going to lock you in here and put these Twinkies on the other side. Feel free not to eat them. And after about 9 or 10 hours, most of us are unwrapping the ding-dongs.
That's right.
And so I get it. I look at somebody like Archie Bunker, and I'm like, where else other than very, very polarized talk radio is he going to feel like we're talking about something other than fluff, even if it's super distorted? And of course, the longer you listen, the farther you get away from reality. And by the time you're 800 pounds and you've eaten your 80th Twinkie, you're kind of done for. So I'm really happy. Somebody I know, when I showed him this show, I've been evangelizing this. I've been putting it all over social media and bringing friends and making them sit down and go, you got to watch this. I'll watch it again with you. And somebody said, thank God that we can actually these days transport. It's like being in a time capsule. We can go back in time and watch, Ed Sullivan and Dick Cavett and all of these things on streaming like Hulu. I think it's an egregious mistake by the people trying to keep us dumb, and I'm really glad they made it.
Yeah, I agree. And it only shows up the decay that's going on now in a much more vivid fashion. I tell people all the time, don't waste your spiritual, philosophical, or intellectual energy on these election cycles. Be about preserving in your own personal world as much of the values and traditions of Western culture that you can, because that's an entrepreneurial approach to it, but that's the approach that's going to ultimately work, because these yahoos aren't going to do it. I'm sorry, they're just they're not going to change the system because they're a part of it. They're not going to come up with any solutions because they've been too dumbed down themselves. So enough of them. Just ignore them. The devil, John Donne's poem, I think, suits the American political situation very well. The devil is a proud spirit and cannot bear to be mocked.
Well, Dr. Farrell, I bought something the other day. We'll shut it down with this, but I bought something the other day that I think will warm your heart. So I felt so strongly about this Dick Cavett show and what had happened to TV that I started thinking about why I don't read history anymore. You know, you go through a Barnes and Noble and they got all these really attractive shelves with really packaged up, glossy, interesting books, interesting looking books about,
Right.
you know, everything, the Middle Ages, Charles the Bald, you know, you name it, there's something there, the two twins in the tower, and you pick it up and it's this stuff that I can't get through 5 or 6 pages before I just throw it down in disgust, and I can't go on. So I got the show got me thinking about, you know, I remember when I used to read history and I liked it, something's wrong. And so I started doing research and I used Google Books. And what I did was I had criteria. Any history that was purely this fluffy narrative got dismissed. Anything that looked like it was designed to prepare you for an SAT got dismissed. And then I narrowed it down to what I'm interested in is this narrative history, but not so idiosyncratic that some guy's just blathering all over the book. And this was very popular in the 19th century, early 20th. You get a book that's written, it's a whole history of the world by one guy, and he's giving you his opinion about butterflies and, you know, and particular horse carriages. And it's like, it's too much. But I don't want just a bare recitation of the facts, because the human brain can only take so many facts without any context, where you don't understand why it was happening and what was happening. It's got to have balance. And I finally found a particular set of history that there's only one of them that exists anywhere for sale on the web. I mean, I searched everywhere, so I ended up having to pay maximum price for this set of history. And I'm reading now about Pepin, and the empire leading up to the Carolingians, and it's great because I can see what he's trying to achieve. There's enough narrative to give me what the objective is and why he wouldn't do certain things and why it's important to get the Pope's blessing and what he's trying to do in regard to Constantinople. I'm getting that, but I'm also getting enough dates and facts that it's not just Pepin was a practical statesman who needed to feel more free in his life. I'm not getting this crap. And I realized that somehow that we had a brief shining moment where history was well written and you could read it and become literate, and then it was bookended by history that it was either all polarized idiosyncratic opinion or was all SAT scores that you couldn't possibly learn if you wanted to.
Right. I agree. The cultural decay is showing up in almost every publication that's being printed now. It's true in almost all the disciplines. You have a lot of fluff. And, I go back to my fundamental criterion for something being a legitimate book of intellectual content, and that's footnote. And the ability to put out ideas without fear of the professional class. This is the other thing. I had an email from a gentleman recently that's a musician, challenging my analysis of the Bach pieces in Thrice Great Hermetica. You're the only one that gets this. Have you run it by a musician? I'm not interested in running any of my stuff by any committee. I'm interested in putting it out there, and people can do with it what they want to, reject it if they want to, modify it if they want to. This is the way conversations occur. But you don't have that tradition anymore, and we're suffering because of it. We have the idea that we have to put everything at an 8th grade level, and that's nonsense, because people are starved for the genuine article. And you're right. You go into Barnes and Noble and you see glossy, nicely packaged books, but in most cases the books are fluff. You're right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I can't read that stuff. And
I can't either.
There's a real hunger. I know people that are desperate to read something about history, but if you throw them any book I can find just about, they get 20 pages in and like, oh God, I can't do this anymore. So I'm really just happy, so your audience doesn't inundate me with emails, I'll mention the what I bought. There's like a huge, $1,000 set that's like 30 or 40 volumes called the World History by Historians that I like, but I don't need that many books. And so I got another one that is really close. And again, you can search the net, but I can't find another copy, maybe in a local used bookstore. But it's called The Standard History of the World by Great Historians. And it's John H. Clifford is the editor. And you can totally find something called The Standard History of the World by Great Historians, but it's a totally different set. It's got Israel Fisher as the editor, and it's exactly the kind of egregious crap that I can't read. But this one by John H. Clifford, you can actually go into Google Books and search for it and see what I mean. There's a couple of volumes of it in there that somebody digitized. And it's crazy intensely readable about the Middle Ages. You know, going back to the ancient times, all the histories of that era were a little bit dodgy, you know, and there's sort of like, first the world was formless and void. It's a little speculative, but you get into something like the late ancient period in the Middle Ages, and it's super readable. Again, that's John H. Clifford, The Standard History of the World by Great Historians. And, you know, we try not to, but occasionally we like to channel these guys in our show. You've heard the curmudgeonliness of Dr. Farrell and I, just modern history is crap and modern history is garbage. And, you know, we're not saying you don't want to eat a little bit of crap and garbage in your life, but just, you know, when you're looking to have an intellectual reference point for who's still having a meaningful debate, I think don't go to Rush Limbaugh. Just play reruns of the Muppets and look at the guys in the balcony, because it'll be Dr. Farrell and I in our old age going, this sucks. This is horrible. Why don't you go home and mount a kangaroo? You know.
Listen. One final comment. You raise a very good point, and I want to point this out. One reason I think that we are in the cultural mess that we're in is that few people really know how crucial the Middle Ages are in the formation of our culture. Few people know medieval history well and all of the things that went on. It was anything but the Dark Ages. It was a crucial, and I think the crucial formative period of our Western culture for so many reasons in science, law, philosophy. And to find a decent history of the Middle Ages, as you know, is just all but impossible. There are no great medievalists out there anymore that are writing in the style that you're talking, and it's to our loss. You know, it's one of those crucial periods that most people are just in a fog about, and I think it's to our loss. Anyway, that's my last 2 cents.
All right. Well, great, Dr. Farrell. It's been a rip-roaring show. Thank you again.
Thank you, sir.
All right. See you next time for the next episode of You'll Find Nazis Even in the